Non-RF weapons. Tesla's novel weapons theories were generally ignored in the United States. Nikola Tesla died in 1943. After the Second World War, all his papers and effects were shipped to his native Yugoslavia, where they were enshrined in a museum. Some say that that museum proved to be a gold mine for Soviet weapons scientists.
We haven't even formally, so far as I know, to ourselves admitted that these weapons exist in the hands of the Soviet Union.
Weapons analyst Tom BEARDEN, a retired U.S. Army lieutenant colonel, is among a small group of scientists and engineers who believe that the Soviets have perfected Tesla's ideas and are developing radio frequency weapons on a scale unimagined in this country.
There have been a series of tests of these kinds of weapons.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, as the case may be. I'm Tom BEARDEN, the author of Excalibur Briefing, and I'm making this 2-hour tape to give you a presentation on some more fundamental work I am releasing in accordance with the Excalibur Briefing. This presentation is on scalar waves and on scalar interferometry, and it deals with the long-lost secret work of Nikola Tesla and also the Soviet weaponization of the Tesla technology. I want to accent that during this briefing we will not have time to cover in great detail everything that should be covered. I hope to highlight, however, the process and the technology that Tesla had, a new technology we do not know today, but one which he had prior to 1900. And we will go into the nature of that technology and what makes it work. The slide we are presenting at this time deals with the conclusion of a report done by then Captain J.D. Lamoth for the Defense Intelligence Agency. And the report predicted that sooner or later the Soviets would be able to do some rather startling things. Know the contents of documents that we tried to secrete from them. Know our troop and ship movements, although we tried to protect them. Know our installation locations and the nature of those installations. To mold thoughts at a distance, to disable equipment, and to kill persons at a distance. That was contained in an official DIA report released under the Freedom of Information Act. And we will give you today the gist of the technology by which we think the Soviets are attempting to accomplish those aims. Since the time of Lenin, the Soviet aims have not changed. They are for eventual world domination of both the world and its peoples. Here on this slide are some startling statements that have been made by Soviet leaders in the past. Some of them you already know about, a couple of them perhaps you do not. I would like to call attention particularly to Khrushchev's 1960 statement to the Soviet Presidium, where he pointed out that the Soviets had a new weapon in development so powerful that if unrestrainedly used, it could wipe out all life on Earth. I also would like to call your attention to the 1975 statement by Brezhnev, where suddenly at the SALT talks, the Soviet side introduced a rather strange proposal that we should also consider outlawing the development of new types of weapons more frightening than the mind of man had ever even imagined. It is my thesis that the Soviets in both cases, both the Khrushchev case and the Brezhnev case, were speaking of the Tesla technology which has been lost in the West. We will first need some brief background. It is widely thought today in physics that the Michelson-Morley experiment eliminated the ether. As Dirac once pointed out, it did no such thing. What it actually eliminated was a material ether. Any Lorentz invariant non-material ether is perfectly consistent with the Michelson-Morley experiment. And in fact, the basic Soviet theory today of psychotronic weapons or Tesla weapons is founded upon that particular principle. They use little pieces of vacuum as a Lorentz invariant ether concept, and from that all of the rest of their physics is derived, particularly those which deal with the weapons and the Tesla weapons. Also, they have advanced the work of Ives, a Western physicist who in the 30s and 40s developed a more fundamental theory of physics. Ives derived all of Einstein's postulates, Newton's laws of motion, relativistic form, and the square law of gravitation from a Lorentz invariant non-material ether theory, a more fundamental theory. His work has been ignored in the West, but it forms the basis of the Soviet threat work today. For example, when Bob Toth, a reporter from the Los Angeles Times, was handed a document by Petchukov on the streets of Moscow, the document purporting to have the secret or the theory of Soviet parapsychology, both the dissident scientist and Bob Toth were seized immediately by the KGB and interrogated. When the KGB found out that neither of them knew what they had, they simply stonewalled it and turned them loose. That is, after the intervention of the U.S. president. In that paper, the theory was speaking of little pieces of vacuum as being the basic approach to the theory. Part of our background also must address the work of another brilliant Western researcher and scientist, Dr. T. Henry Moray of Salt Lake City, Utah. In the 1920s and 1930s, Dr. Moray had successfully tapped the almost infinite energy of vacuum, the zero-point energy as we call it today. By 1939, Dr. Moray was obtaining 50 kilowatts of power from a 55-pound device straight out of pure nothing, pure vacuum, tapping the zero-point energy. The device used 29 tubes, 29 special stage tubes that he had painstakingly managed to build out of thousands attempted over the period of years. In 1939, a Soviet agent in that laboratory working with the device under Dr. Moray suddenly destroyed the device and beat it to pieces, heart-rendingly destroying the work of a lifetime. He also, however, had obtained drawings of the device, and we can be assured these drawings had been transmitted back to the Soviet Union. And so in 1939, there is a very good point where we know the Soviet Union had obtained the fact that you can build such an amplifier, you can get the energy of vacuum amplified, and we know that they had obtained the basic secret of it in 1939 from Dr. Moray in Salt Lake City, Utah. Now, as everyone knows, the U.S. in World War II successfully built the atomic bomb. 2 atomic bombs dropped on Japan brought a fanatical, dedicated nation to its knees and caused its prompt surrender. At Potsdam, Truman told Stalin about the surprise development of the atomic bomb. Stalin, with a stone face, made no reaction. However, it is our thesis that when Stalin returned to Russia, he called in all his chief scientists in a rage. Stalin, you see, had planned to take over the world or make the Soviet move about 2 years after World War II. He knew that the West would beat its swords back into plowshares. All he had to do was maintain his armies intact, wait for them to disarm and dismantle their defenses, and then attack and seize Europe in 6 weeks. It would have worked except for the surprise development of the atomic bomb by the United States, heavily contributed to, of course, by Britain and by many of the other scientists that had been run out of Europe by Hitler. Now Stalin no longer could mass his troops, and so he had to wait and he had to catch up in the new weaponry. In a fury, he told his scientists that the destiny of communism had been frustrated by this great U.S. technological breakthrough, but that it would not be the last such technical breakthrough, but the next one had better be Soviet. Now, this is a man who's an absolute dictator. He kills his foes and his enemies, and no one dared oppose him. And so the entire Soviet Academy of Science did a backflip, a 180-degree turn, and took off into the hinterland, studying everything that existed that passed as paranormal or unknown phenomena. Wherever you found a yogi walking on fire or lying on a bed of nails or meditating, you were likely to find the Soviet scientific team studying and instrumenting them if possible. Their scientific colleagues might rail at them that this was not science, but the state kept right on paying their salary. It is my thesis that because of this effort, the Soviets resurrected the Moray work and resurrected the secret of Tesla. In going through the material of the West, which they set up a large effort to do, they discovered that the Tesla material had been lost, and they began to work on the secret. And so we have emerging then two primary things which we must look for in fueling the Soviet frightening new kinds of weapons unknown to the West. One of these is the Moray amplifier. The other is the Tesla technology. Now, in 1958, a very strange nuclear accident occurred in Russia. This accident was an explosion of atomic waste, we are told, from people who were nearby or who were connected with the treatment of casualties from the accident itself. If so, it left its signature, because T. Henry Moray, in his special tubes, had found it necessary to use a radioactive nucleus. The radioactive nucleus is one of the things which will tune in or interact with the strange Tesla waves that we will be covering later on in this presentation. And so, if we can believe that shortly after World War II, the Soviets resurrected the Moray amplifier, and by the early 50s had discovered the Tesla technology that had been buried in the West, then it is quite reasonable that by 1958 they would have been embarked in the building of great new weapons. This one, for example, was a weapon which would transmit a nuclear explosion through hyperspace. That is, it would transmit it out of our space and time at one location, pop it into a tuner at another space-time location in our world, with no travel in our world in between the 2 points. I will give you later a specific case in which I think this was successfully accomplished. Such a hyperspace howitzer, of course, would be using the Moray technology, we believe, in that time frame. We believe that in the early 1950s, perhaps by 1950 itself, the Soviets were embarked on the development of weapons from this technology. By 1958, they should have been in the advanced prototype or even towards the early operational deployment stage, certainly in advanced development. And we believe what happened was a howitzer of this type blew up in an unsuccessful test. The reason it blew is because when it went tuned into hyperspace, we believe the tuning mechanism was damaged, and instead of going narrowband, it went broadband. If that indeed happened, then the nearest broadband tuner would have gotten it. The nearest broadband tuner were the hot radioactive waste stored nearby the facility. Those wastes had all kinds of radioactive nuclei there, all kinds of tuners, and therefore a very broadband tuner existed nearby. So the howitzer simply blew the facility apart because the explosion emerged from the atomic waste nearby. But continuing our story, we switch now to a very strange incident shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis. First, let us speak of the Cuban Missile Crisis. As you know, in 1962, Khrushchev, ever the ebullient peasant, began to stick long-range missiles at great speed into Cuba. These missiles would have covered the United States like a glove with nuclear firepower, and in one fell swoop, he would have changed the nuclear strategic balance of power. Of course, this was detected, and John F. Kennedy decided to call his bluff. In fact, Kennedy knew he was bluffing because at that time a Soviet colonel by the name of Penkovsky was cooperating with us by the courtesy of British intelligence, and Penkovsky verified that the Soviets were in fact not ready to withstand a nuclear assault, and their defenses and their nuclear missiles were in terrible shape. So Kennedy knew Khrushchev was bluffing and he would have to back down. In that aspect then, Kennedy called his bluff, and of course, as you see, Khrushchev did back down. What Kennedy did not know was that the great new superweapons were almost ready. But Khrushchev had jumped the gun, the weapons were not yet deployed, and so although we knew nothing of the superweapons, they were not available for use. Therefore, Khrushchev backed down during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We point out to you that is a very serious offense in the Soviet Union, in any communist state. A very serious loss of face had occurred. Khrushchev's days were numbered before he would be overthrown as the leader of the Soviet Union. And he knew this. At that moment, he was in a desperate race for time to get his superweapons deployed and do something which would recover face and maintain leadership for a while longer. In April 1963, a few short months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, it is my thesis that the Soviet superweapons became operational for the first time. That is, the howitzer, for example. It is also my thesis that in April of that same year, Khrushchev scored a major triumph as a demonstration to the leaders of the Communist Party and the party membership that indeed his policy was the best. He did this to recover face and maintain his leadership. I am convinced that on the 10th of April 1963, from a remote facility in the Soviet Union, a weapon was directed against the U.S. Thresher atomic submarine, and that atomic submarine was destroyed from a Soviet laboratory as a full-up operational test of the first of Khrushchev's great new superweapons. I believe the submarine was destroyed utilizing its photograph. As we know from radionics, any photograph already maintains the pattern of the object, and it can resonate through hyperspace with that particular object. We will find later in this presentation that we are dealing with waves which can travel much faster than the speed of light and including infinite velocity. At infinite velocity, every point in the universe is totally together. And so any photograph which maintains the pattern of its object in the virtual state interactions imposed on it is in fact tied directly to that object with no distance between them in hyperspace. It is thus possible to use the photograph to direct that kind of wave directly onto the object at a distance, no matter where in the universe it might be located. If we check the incidents surrounding the loss of the Thresher, we find several very strange circumstances involved. Number one, the ship apparently began to disobey or not respond to its controls, and so it was in trouble when it started its deep dive. Another incident, which is very indicative indeed, is that its companion ship, the USS Skylark, on the surface above it, experienced great difficulty with its communication systems, several types of systems. In fact, when it became apparent to the Skylark that the submarine had been lost, it took over 1 hour, or just about 1 hour, for the submarine to transmit an emergency message because of the communications difficulties experienced. I point out to you that the Tesla technology we will be discussing later can cause such communications difficulties in multiple systems, and that is one of the signatures of the use of such weapons. Here on this slide we show a typical deep underwater nuclear burst. There's a standard formula to calculate such a depth at which the burst does not vent the gas bubble. In that case, the only thing that happens is a great wall of water rises up out of the ocean in a mushroom or conical type shape, mushrooms out and falls back into the ocean. One day after the death of the Thresher, that is on April the 11th, 1963, a jet airliner flying past 100 miles north of Puerto Rico saw a sudden emergence from the ocean of exactly this type of great mushroom-shaped cloud of water, which rose up approximately 1/2 mile and then fell back into the water. The incident was reported to the FBI and to the Coast Guard when the jet airliner landed. It has been scrubbed off and nothing was ever done about that particular anomalous report. A full report on that incident is in the files of SITU, the Society for the Investigation of the Unexplained. It is my thesis that what happened here was the first full-up successful test of an operational hyperspace howitzer from the Soviet Union. That is, a Soviet submarine passing by dropped off an underwater receiver for the test. And then from the laboratory in the Soviet Union, a full-up nuclear explosion was transmitted through hyperspace into that receiver in the ocean successfully. And so on April the 11th, Khrushchev had succeeded in a great 1-2 punch as a full demonstration to the Communist Party that indeed the new operational weapons were there, and indeed he, Khrushchev, should remain as their leader. We would like to pause briefly now and return once again to the past to Dr. Nikola Tesla. Dr. Tesla is a strange genius who essentially gave us almost single-handed the electrical 20th century. Before 1900, Nikola Tesla was firing lightning bolts 75 to 100 feet in distance. He had built the most powerful coil ever built in the history of man, or ever dreamed of. He also had developed and also later designed the LC oscillatory circuit, which made radio possible. He in fact conquered AC power and made it practical by in fact inventing the rotating magnetic field, by which most of our AC motors and generators still are operating. They are still Tesla generators and Tesla motors in most cases. And so he made it practical to transmit AC power at a distance. This indeed wiped out the dreams of Edison, who was backing direct current and direct power. In that case, in direct power case, you would have to have a generator plant about every 20 miles or so across the face of the earth. You can imagine what a great financial empire was involved. And in one fell stroke, Nikola Tesla wiped out the dreams of that kind of empire by Edison. Also, by just before 1900, he had developed a great tower and was transmitting signals through the earth because he had found a new type of wave, a totally new kind of electromagnetic wave. He had found that he could set up standing waves in the earth with this type of wave, a scalar wave, and that the molten core of the earth and or the electrical energy flowing in the earth would feed energy into his standing scalar wave. He himself knew that in that standing scalar wave matrix there would form then ordinary electrical energy based on the matrix. And so enormous energy would begin to form on the matrix that he placed in the earth, and anywhere on the earth that anyone put up an antenna tuned to that frequency, one could extract electrical power. If one wanted more power, one simply put up additional antennas or better antennas. But with one generator station, Tesla could have fueled the world and given free energy to mankind for all time. When his financial backers discovered that this is what he was about, they in fact set out to destroy him, for they considered him a dangerous madman. We accent that Tesla was not using Hertzian waves. He had passed that stage previously. Tesla was using a more fundamental electromagnetic wave that we have yet to use in the West. And it is the fundamental wave that fuels the Soviet weapons today, that is, the strange new superweapons. Tesla used a scalar wave. Specifically, he used a wave of phi field, static electric potential, electrostatic potential, well known in the theory. He also knew that two paired or two coupled scalar potential waves made a Hertzian wave. And so any Hertzian wave is nothing in the world but two coupled Tesla waves. In other words, the present electromagnetics is a highly special case of the more expanded electromagnetics that emerges once we use the scalar wave directly without such coupling into ordinary vector waves. Tesla knew the coupling could be at a distance, and so it did not matter where the two scalar waves met and coupled. At that point where coupling occurred, one would have ordinary vector electromagnetic wave, Hertzian waves, or energy, if you will. When his backers found out what he really intended to do, that is, give free energy to mankind forever, they knew that this would destroy many financial empires which depended for their control upon the control of energy production and energy resources. So they considered Tesla a dangerous madman. All his financial backing was removed. Eventually his laboratory was burned. Various and sundry other blockages were put in his way, and this man then eventually became a non-person. He was totally isolated. So the man who had been the greatest inventor and scientist of the world in 1900, by 1914, had already become essentially a forgotten non-person. On this slide I am showing some excerpts from the history of the development of what today is called Hertzian potential in electromagnetic theory. I want to call your attention particularly to the 1903 paper by Whittaker, who proved that any vector field can be replaced with two scalar fields. In other words, by projection from that, then any vector wave can be replaced as two scalar waves. And this essentially is the thing that Tesla had discovered. Notice the close timing of the 1903 Whittaker paper with the fundamental work that had been done already by Tesla. So, in fact, in the hardcore theory today, there already exists the proof of the coupling of Tesla waves into ordinary vector electromagnetic waves. The theory was extended later by other workers in the field, particularly the work of Nisbet in 1955. And on this slide we show some of the work that we referred to. That is, the paper by Nisbet and other work in the field. This again is not a comprehensive reference list at all. It is merely pointing out that in the foundations of electromagnetic theory, the case for the Tesla wave and Tesla pair coupling into electromagnetic wave already exists, but has been lost in the West. In the West, we have concentrated our attention specifically on the vector wave, on the Hertzian wave, which can only move at a single velocity in vacuum. C, the velocity of light. Specifically, c is the velocity of the vector wave. If we have scalar waves, they need not be bound by that velocity at all. In fact, we will find later that the phi field, for example, can move at any velocity or be made to move at any velocity, essentially from 0 to infinity. On our next slide, we point out some present theoretical facts that one should be aware of. First of all, the present phi field is totally a spatial concept. The idea of potential was derived and worked out primarily back in the 1800s. And during that time, the march of time, the time flow rate itself, was thought to be an immutable act of God and unchangeable by man himself. We know today that is not true. Relativity has taught us that the flow of time can in fact be changed and slowed down at least. However, in the 1800s, that fact was not known. Potential theory was developed well before Einstein's relativity came along. And so we find then a spatial potential. In other words, the clear assumption that the flow of time is a constant for everything. The flow of time is assumed constant in the present electromagnetic theory as it is set up with spatial phi field, which I'm calling on this slide phi 3. We also know that any spatial gradient in such a field gives us a vector. In other words, all vectors are two-point functions. We must have 2 points in the field, and we must have a difference in potential between them before we can have a potential gradient and therefore a vector field. The concept of voltage is also a 2-point function. It is always the voltage between 2 points. The motion of an object is the thing that moves it from one point to another, and it is the motion of an object which indeed accounts for all vector fields. If a static charge could absolutely be static, it would have no vector field whatsoever, but only have a phi scalar field. It is the frantic movement, for example, of electrons on a statically charged ball, which accounts, the wiggles of those electrons accounts for the production of the E field and associated B fields. The gradient, however, is between separated points in two superposed phi fields if the two of them are superposed. And phi field can move at infinite velocity. And if you do not believe that, I suggest you check page 223 in Jackson, Classical Electrodynamics, 2nd edition, which is one of the best graduate texts in classical electrodynamics in the United States. If you check that reference, you will find the blunt statement that the phi field does move at infinite velocity. Actually, that is the velocity the way it is presently portrayed in the theory. If we begin to use scalar waves, we can vary the velocity anywhere from 0 to infinity, anywhere in between. And now we point out the physical interpretation of the potential, the phi field, the electrostatic potential. In the present theory, it is the stress in space. The real phi field, the one which Tesla used, is a 4-dimensional phi field, not a 3-dimensional one. It is the stress on space-time itself, the medium itself. In fact, that stress is 4-dimensional, not 3-dimensional, and therefore can be used to stress the flow of time. Now, if we stress the rate at which time itself flows, we can affect anything and everything that exists in that time flow. For example, we can affect thought, we can affect minds, we can affect the fundamental constants of nature, the inertia of an object, the gravitational field. All of those exist in time, and all of them are changed if we mess up or mess with the time flow in which they exist. And so when we have a phi-4 field, the stress on space-time itself, we are dealing now with a fundamental unified field because it crosses all fields of nature. Any field is affected by the phi-4 field. The Tesla phi-4 field, then, is a more fundamental phi field than the one presently used in the theory. It is the stress on space-time itself, without voltage, without E field or any other vector field applied. It is a purely scalar field concept. From that concept, for example, we can have pure potentials with no vectors attached to them. We can have no V or no E field and yet have a phi field or even a phi field wave. This kind of a wave will penetrate any physical medium. We can produce EM fields at a distance if we couple two of the waves together at a distance to form vector electromagnetic waves by pair coupling. They can be pure time waves because moving in 4 dimensions rather than 3, these waves can either move spatially like a normal wave or they can move in time only, sit at one point and simply fluctuate in magnitude. But in fluctuating, they are stressing the time flow itself, and therefore they are affecting every fundamental constant of nature, the gravitational field, the inertia of mass, etc., etc. And so they are very real fields which do unified field theory concepts and technology already. And that is the field which Tesla had discovered with his instruments and with his devices prior to 1900. Here again we summarize some of the strange characteristics to be expected of the Tesla field. For example, we can establish standing waves in the Earth or in the ionosphere. Actually, you could establish them anywhere. We can tap energy from the Earth's core. That is the one which indeed was responsible for the suppression of Nikola Tesla. The wave can travel faster or slower than the speed of light. Already in the limited electromagnetic theory we have, we recognize that phi field can travel at infinite velocity, and I gave you that reference. It can also be made to travel at a slower velocity, because if you adjust the amplitude of the wave that you produce, for a given medium that it is going through, there will be a certain amount of pair coupling. The drag is due to pair coupling into vectors. Vectors are forces and drags. You do not have drag from scalar concepts only. So the amount of coupling into drag determines the speed of the wave. If we produce a higher velocity wave, we must produce a higher potential on it. And so we can control the velocity simply by controlling the amplitude of the initial wave for a given medium that we are transmitting it through. That is one example of the way you can control the speed of the wave. It can change the rate of time flow and does. It can affect all fields, including gravity. It can commute between the virtual and the observable states presently so mysteriously separated, because it is a true point function. If we take a single quantum change, delta L, delta P, we can go to any particular small delta L we wish, including subquantal. And so this is the magic field, which is the hidden variable theory that goes between the subquantum state and the quantum states known today. This is the magic field that is searched for both as the hidden variable theory and both as the unified field theory, since it also can tackle gravitational field. As one example on this chart, we show the magic wave that Tesla discovered and called his standing columnar wave. For example, looking at the bottom diagram, this is a little space-time diagram. The vertical line is time, the horizontal line is 3-space or laboratory space. The Tesla wave is a magnitude of phi which will be somewhere between the time dimension and the 3 spatial dimensions. It can be anywhere in between. In fact, it can even move back and forth between them. If it does that, then a very unusual type of wave motion results in our normal space. What results is the wave, as it is down here in the space medium, just moves like a normal wave with a certain velocity. As it produces or approaches the time movement axis only, it stops at a point and sits there, waxing and waning and affecting all the fields and fundamental constants of nature. As it then moves back towards the space-time medium, it picks up velocity again, until again it's moving in space. it gives you then the type of wave shown on top. On top we show that sitting at a point and messing with every other field of nature and all the fundamental constants, gradually releasing its effect on the flow of time and moving through space, then slowing down and starting once again to seriously affect the flow of time and all the other fundamental fields and forces and constants and so forth. The velocity chart or velocity plot is shown in the middle graph. It simply picks up velocity and stops, picks up velocity and stops while it's doing its thing. Now, other people besides Tesla and Morey have stumbled onto parts of this particular technology. For example, in World War I, the United States Navy utilized the Rogers undersea and underground transmission system to transmit underwater to its submarines around the world. They also used it to transmit through the earth to American Expeditionary Forces headquarters in Europe. The work was declassified in 1919, and it was hailed as a major triumph. It was exclaimed that all the surface antennas would be wiped out because of this new fundamental discovery. And Tesla also affirmed that the Rogers work was utilizing the Tesla wave, not the Hertzian wave. That was in 1919 that declassification occurred. Mysteriously, by 1920 or 21, all reference to that and to the great promise of this new technology was wiped out as if by an unseen glove. No way, in no fashion, apparently, was the Tesla wave going to be allowed to produce free energy for mankind and advanced communication systems. Also, according to the fundamental research work of Dr. Robert Beck, this same technology has been rediscovered at least 3 times since World War II, and in each case, again, has been mysteriously squelched in the West. In the West, the technology that Tesla had discovered before 1900 has been repeatedly suppressed up to the present day. On this slide again we show a thing which is presently missing from electromagnetic theory. The fact that the scalar waves are there, and also that the scalar waves can couple to form vector waves at a distance. Also, I'd like to point out some other omissions from the present electromagnetic theory. One of the crucial and critical aspects of the theory that is fallacious is the confusion of charge and charged mass. They are not even dimensionally the same thing. Mass does not exist in time. Mass time does. Mass is totally a spatial or three-dimensional concept. If we believe quantum mechanics, the charge on a mass, for example, of a charged particle, is due to the emission and absorption of virtual particles, such as virtual photons. It is this virtual flux, then, which is charge. It is not the mass, but it is that virtual flux connected with the mass. The charge connected with a mass produces a charged mass, that is, a charged particle. But in the theory, the two are made synonymous. It is not possible to do work on charge. It is only possible to do work on mass. Force is defined in the simplest case as mass times acceleration. No mass, no force. So phi field, in fact, is nothing in the world but the intensity, or the force-space density, if you will, of the force-space virtual flux in a region. It does not matter whether or not there is any mass, observable mass, in that region. For example, if we believe the present theories of vacuum, vacuum itself has a very high level of primordial electromagnetic energy. It is also full of scalar waves. In fact, everything is going bananas. Incredible amounts of energy are in the pure vacuum itself. These energies are there in the form of charged, not as charged mass. In other words, there is no observable mass connected with them, and that's what the vacuum is. And so the present theory must be again changed. We must substitute at least 3 terms for every term that presently has charge. One term is charge itself in the correct sense. The second term is the mass that's connected with the charge. And the third term is the relationship or the connection or coupling between the two. Now, a scalar wave is a wave in the background phi sub 0 of vacuum itself. In the present theory, that phi sub 0 is assumed 0. It is not 0. It is, in fact, a very high value. It is, on the average, constant if nothing is disturbing it. But if we produce phi waves, scalar waves, Tesla waves, what we are producing are in fact waves in the phi sub-zero medium, space-time itself. In other words, space-time is phi sub-zero, and phi sub-zero is four-dimensional. And that is what the phi sub-zero wave is produced in. That is what Tesla found out. You can actually shake the fundamental space-time medium itself by the phi field Tesla scalar wave. The scalar wave is also a longitudinal oscillation. When coupled, the pair couple makes a vector wave, which is a transverse oscillation. And so transverse waves, or Hertzian waves, are always coupled scalar longitudinal waves. That coupling can occur at a distance. It need not occur immediately at the point at which the scalar wave is produced. However, in our real world, there are so many moving charges, essentially everything is charged, that the moment a scalar wave is produced, much of it or most of it is coupled with other scalar waves that are being produced around or passing through the vicinity. And so we find, for example, excited states of atoms emitting photons, that is, pair-coupled scalar waves. They also emit some scalar waves that are not coupled, but we have no instruments at present to detect them. For example, the scalar wave does not push electrons. It takes a force to push an electron, and that's a vector concept. You don't get it unless you have a vector wave. The scalar wave doesn't push electrons, and so our electron-pushing detectors do not detect it. Strong scalar waves can be detected, for example, with such things as Geiger tubes, because the Geiger tube is a pileup of charged masses, but we don't care too much about the mass, just look at the piled-up charge. In other words, the charge density is increased. And so if we pass a phi wave through there, it rides like a cork on a wave of water and rides up higher in phi wave. It's as if every single electron acquired a little bit greater charge, a little bit greater phi field. And so if it becomes great enough, that increases the ionization, we get a cascade discharge, and so the Geiger tube will read. It gives us vector fields, and that pushes electrons, and we get an indication. If we wish to detect weaker scalar fields, we must indeed use interferometry techniques. We must pair couple to produce vector fields, and that is scalar interferometry. And so we use such things, if we wish to detect them, as electron interferometers. Now, there are indeed some natural scalar interferometers around that can be studied if one is very careful. One of the standard phenomena that is produced by this fashion is what is called earth stress lights, earthquake lights, mystery lights, ghost lights, and so forth. There's a myriad of terms for the will-o'-the-wisp. It is produced usually in or near fault zones in the earth. Now let us discuss what we have when we have a tectonic plate fault zone in the earth itself. In other words, we have a split under pressure, under high stress, of the tectonic plate rock itself. In that case, what we have is something like on this diagram. Each place we have a crack, we have, for example, very high pressure in the rock on each side of the crack, and it is stress relieved in the crack itself. And so we have indeed a scalar interferometer. The rock is producing very high phi field from the charges of the telluric currents flowing through it and the pressure. It is also producing it on the other side, and those two can couple together and form vector waves under certain circumstances. Now, the quartz in the rock is in fact a piezoelectric crystal, and there are little grains of various size in the quartz, and they're randomly oriented by and large. Under pressure, then, this becomes what we can refer to as a Prigogine system. Ilya Prigogine in 1977 was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics for producing a new thermodynamics of systems far from thermal equilibrium. And this is such a system, or can be, in a scalar interferometer in a natural stress points and fault zone in the earth. For example, under the Prigogine effect, what we are now are led to believe is that from total disorder, highly chaotic disorder, large-scale order can emerge and stabilize, completely in contradistinction to the present linear thermodynamics theory. And in fact, if this system becomes a Prigogine system, that is what happens. Large-scale orders of electromagnetic field emerge and stabilize, and so we will expect to produce electromagnetic field at a distance. The way it's actually produced at a distance is with coupling of scalar waves. That is, each of the little tiny quartz crystals also has little stress cracks in it and also is a little tiny interferometer. And so these little scalar interferometers have a myriad of, for example, frequencies that they are producing as they are squeezed and stressed. They constitute an approach toward a Fourier transform of patterns. Under certain conditions, those patterns can actually form based on Fourier transformation. And if two of them form at a distance just right, they couple to form the standard little spook light or mystery light that we see connected with fault zones and earth stress activity. And that is exactly how they are produced, and they are produced by Tesla scalar interferometry. Now on this slide we show that in a little bit greater detail. We show again the fractured rock from one side of that scalar interferometer, and we show the myriad of little small scalar interferometers that occur in the quartz and in the rock itself. And so what we have is an ever-evolving system of scalar interferometers, each feeding the other. In that case, we can get very powerful phi fields from each side of this rock stresses and the interferometer, and we can get coupling at a distance to form the mysterious will-o'-the-wisp, ghost light, spook light, and so forth. Here is a photograph of a so-called spook light or earth stress light taken near Florence, Alabama by two young researchers who are doing some very fine field research. As you can see, what we have is a light that is formed in the sky. It's quite bright for its size. It's small, but it's bobbling and moving along. This is due to the erratic changes in the earth currents that are feeding the fault zone interferometer. This is an example. The best example of research done in the United States on such stress lights is the work done by Vestigia that has been published in, for example, the Vestigia newsletter. Some very fundamental work and very nice theoretical work and instrumental work in the field has been done by the Vestigia experiments. They have measured, for example, ordinary electromagnetic wave emission from such an area as the spook light. They have measured its concentration in the infrared as opposed to the visible spectrum, and they have confirmed the reading of a Geiger tube, for example, connected with the phenomena by actual instrumentation in the field. Again, all explained by Tesla scalar interferometry. Actually, another very good scalar interferometer is sitting up between the two ears of each listener. The two cerebral halves, for example, form such a scalar interferometry. The way one must produce phi wave without all the coupling or without so much coupling is that the charged masses, the ions or the electrons, for example, that are used to pile up to produce phi field must be moved at great speed, essentially at breakdown of the medium velocity. They must be moved as quickly as possible and then stabilized to hold the activity, the virtual state activity that constitutes charge. And so the way we actually must produce phi waves without so much coupling into vector waves is in that fashion. And that is why the human nervous system, for example, utilizes cascade discharges across large numbers of nerve fibers. For example, brain waves, so-called, are not waves along a wire. They are, in fact, cascade discharges of charged particles, for example. And it is in that fashion that the human system is able to use scalar waves and couple them then into vector waves, which will move the charges and give signals. I do not have time in this lecture to go into that, but let me say this. All of the phenomena of classical parapsychology can be explained by the new idea of phi field, that is a phi-4 field, by scalar waves and by scalar interferometry. It means that a finely tuned system, for example, human system, is able to form two scalar patterns at a distance, couple them and form energy at a distance. Energy on an object, for example, and that is psychokinesis when the object moves. That is the exact mechanism by which it is done. Just as the human system used electricity long before we knew anything about it, it used FM, for example, it also uses Tesla scalar waves, and it uses scalar interferometry. As shown on this slide, the Russian experimenter, the Russian woman in the laboratory on the slide, is being instrumented and measured as she performs a psychokinesis. Now, in this case, what happened is that all her body rhythms get in phase. then electrostatic energy begins to form on the object itself, electrostatic field. In other words, clearly showing that she is producing additional phi field on the object. The motion of charges in the object immediately makes vector field, and so we get a vector force on that thing which produces movement, and that is the way she does psychokinesis in the laboratory. With scalar technology, there are large numbers of free energy fields and free energy systems waiting to be tapped, sources of unlimited energy available for mankind if we but bend the Tesla technology to our will. For example, some of them are shown on this chart here. The zero-point vacuum energy, which has already been successfully tapped by T. Henry Moray. The Dirac sea, for example, can be gone into directly with a scalar wave, and you can tap the energy of that sea, and that's inexhaustible. Time derivative fields themselves can be tapped just by differentiating the time and changing the rate of flow of time. Microelectrodynamic fluctuations of electricity can be tapped. We already know in fine grain that the ordinary electric field or electric current that we push through circuits is nothing in the world but the time triggers for enormous oscillations at nearly right angles to that. That's just classical electrodynamics. When we go to high enough frequency, the energy there is almost mind-boggling in our ordinary circuits. All that we really need is an extremely fast full-wave rectifier, and you can get free energy out of any electrical circuit that you already have. You could, for example, take a flashlight battery and power a modern automobile or even a battleship with that kind of technology. Telluric currents of the Earth are inexhaustible, as indeed is the Earth's core energy, which Tesla was going to tap, and the G-strain energy of space-time itself, the gravitational energy of all of the universe, is available for our tapping with Tesla waves and Tesla technology. For example, here we are showing the general scheme by which Tesla could have tapped the molten core energy of the Earth itself. As we show on the figure, we set up a standing wave through the Earth. There's one or two ways to do that. Once we have the standing scalar wave, we have a matrix in the Earth. Now, inside the molten core itself, there is very high stress, and so a great amount of phi field is being produced by those charged activities here. That phi field there is of every frequency, every shape, and every phase. It immediately begins to couple when it hits in phase and so forth with the matrix, and it begins to form ordinary electromagnetic vector wave there on the matrix. And so gradually that matrix scalar wave converts itself into an enormous and increasing vector wave of electromagnetic energy. And anybody that puts up an antenna can use that. That is also useful or used by the Soviets as an earthquake generator weapon, for example. If you then shift your matrix in frequency to dump the energy, for example, onto the point opposite you on the Earth that you've established your standing wave, you begin to dump the electromagnetic energy in there. That's just a phasing problem. Okay, at that point what happens is the stresses in the plate begin to build up because of the enormous addition of new energy. The telluric currents go up and the plate stresses go up. If we do that slowly, the nearest fault zone will give and we'll have a natural earthquake. If we do it very sharply, what will happen is we'll shatter the rock itself, whether there's a fault zone there or not, and we will get an earthquake that's deliberately induced. The earthquake in 1978 near Tabas, Iran, left an anomalous signature of fractured rock in that case, and I've already pointed out in my book, The Excalibur Briefing, why the Soviets had to generate that earthquake to stress relieve the fault zone on the border between Iran and Russia that was threatening their own city. They did it to save one of their cities, but the earthquake left its anomalous signature. It was done by Tesla technology. Now, in that case, when you have the standing wave, you can think of it very simply as follows. Think of the molten core of the Earth now becoming a cathode, which is feeding enormous amounts of energy to you. The signal that we're putting in the scalar field is a signal on the grid. And so we are gating a much more enormous energy across to use. I point out that if you phase your matrix, when you change your standing scalar wave matrix to dump the energy into the atmosphere over there, you can directly and very drastically affect all the weather patterns on that side of the Earth. And the Soviets, I believe, have used it in that fashion also. Next, we wish to point out something very fundamental that can be evolved directly with the Tesla wave and Tesla technology, and that is the use of a radioactive nucleus. And on this slide, we are discussing that use. In this part of the photograph here on the right, or the drawing, we are drawing inside an atom, for example, we are representing the condition such that we have an excited nucleus. The nucleus would like to decay, and in this case I've drawn one that would like to emit a beta particle, an electron. And so it's trying to decay and trying to emit an electron anyway. It's in an unbalanced state. Now there's all kinds of free electrons that are not free that are bound up in the Dirac sea, which permeates everything, the sea of negative energy electrons. So if we put now the system and make it a many-particle system in which this electron exists, for example, Moray in doing so ground up germanium and ground up several other things, including a radioactive nucleus material, grind them very finely and press them at extreme high pressure and paralyze them so that the stresses were locked in. In other words, he was building a Prigogine transistor a little bit more advanced than anything we built to this day. What you have going on in that case is this. If we believe linear thermodynamics, negative temperature is higher than any positive temperature. And so on this graph I show on the left, zero temperature on the positive kind of temperature on the bottom, rising to infinite positive temperature on the left. That's the same thing as zero negative temperature, and negative temperatures then go on up above the positive infinite temperature. There are even experiments, for example, with nuclear magnetic resonance, where we can watch a particle come down through positive infinity temperature. The Dirac sea is up here in the negative energy states. If we establish a Prigogine effect, however, we make it highly nonlinear, and so we establish a nonlinear position from the Dirac sea down into the normal positive area. In other words, now electrons in the Dirac sea can on occasion fall down through this Prigogine tunnel and come off with very high positive temperatures. And so you can tap the Dirac sea with a combination Prigogine effect and Tesla scalar phenomenology. Going back over to my diagram on the right, what happens is we put a scalar field, scalar potential, onto that Dirac sea electron. We force it out through the nucleus itself that's trying to emit an electron. The electron is bounced out of the nucleus and immediately replaced by the one lifted from the Dirac sea, and so the nucleus does not decay. This is a reaction that is not presently known in physics. That is, the emission of the beta particle from an excited nucleus, but the nucleus remains excited and unbalanced. And that is due to the Prigogine effect and the use of a Tesla scalar interferometer. Next, let's pause briefly and point out how we get a three-dimensional waveform in the first place. We have to use standard three-dimensional Fourier transform. In other words, we can express any two-dimensional shape we know in terms of an infinite series of frequencies. To use in a practical sense, we truncate that series after, let us say, 10 or 12 terms. And that will give the wave shape that we wish, or the pattern, in two dimensions fairly accurately. To form a three-dimensional pattern, however, we must have two of those. We must have one for the other axis. And so then when we put the two together, we will have a three-dimensional waveform. And that is three-dimensional Fourier transform, truncated so that we can use a finite number of transmitters and a finite number of frequencies. In other words, it will require us to use two Tesla transmitters to use scalar interferometry in 3 dimensions. And on our next slide, we show such a scalar interferometer, for example, a huge facility that might be built if one were attempting to use this effect as a weapon. In other words, the projection of energy at a distance, or what Tesla in the early 1900s had called his wireless transmission of energy without loss at a distance. In this case, as you can see, we have 2 scalar antennas. They're fed by a control and switching mechanism in the building shown here in the fine drawing by Hal Crawford. And not shown on the drawing, of course, would be a power source or a series of power sources to feed the interferometer. You can see the various wavelengths of the interferometer marked off to show you that we're using from each antenna a truncated Fourier transform, and the pair combination makes a scalar field form at a distance. And so with this arrangement, we can produce in space a form, a three-dimensional form, that is traveling at a given velocity. We can, for example, adjust that velocity by determining or adjusting the magnitude of the phi field produced in the first place. And indeed, such interferometers, Tesla interferometers as this, already exist in the Soviet Union, as shown in our next view. Here we show an artist's conception of the Soviet facility at Sereshchegan that is indeed a Tesla howitzer. This is taken from the pages of Aviation Week and Space Technology and is being used here with their permission. Now, it is presently thought or conjectured by the West that this thing might be a high-energy laser or particle beam weapon. It could, in fact, for example, do elementary particle beam weapon work if indeed radioactive nuclei are being used inside the scalar antenna. In addition, however, its prime purpose is a Tesla scalar interferometer, a Tesla howitzer. I maintain this is a third-generation weapon that is presently on site. As you can see from the slide, we have the two scalar antenna out front. We have the mark-off positions along the baseline between them for the wavelengths to be used in the Fourier transform sections with each antenna. We have the computer-controlled facility in the middle in the building that switches and controls all the various frequencies feeding that are coming from the transmitter. And back at the rear, we have a series of power sources. In fact, on this particular howitzer, we have apparently two kinds of power sources. The forward bank of generators are thought to be explosive generators, those kind of ordinary generators in which the Soviet Union is known to lead the world. Behind them, however, there is a bank of 13 generators, one extra one, which I believe are Moray-type generators. The Moray generators, for example, will furnish enormous energy, almost unlimited, and there's an extra one to run the facility. I pointed out in my book, The Excalibur Briefing, that the Moray generators, because they use so many stages in them, will have a most unusual failure mode. At certain times, all of them will fail and cease to operate because the flux in which they operate goes unstable, and so they lose their coherence and they cease operating. In that situation, every one of them of that type quits working, a failure mode not known to any other weapon system. If weapon A doesn't work, then weapon B won't work. And so if the Moray generators fail, the howitzer to be used at all must have some ordinary power being furnished, and that will come then, of course, from the explosive generators. It could also come, for example, from advanced ordinary power sources such as magnetohydrodynamic generators. The howitzer has, for example, 4 modes. 2 major modes, continuous pulse, continuous wave, or pulse mode. In a pulse mode, what happens is we simply fire one pulse and fire another one behind it to catch up with it and couple at a distance. In a continuous mode, we fire a continuous pulse wave and a second pulse wave to come up behind it at a higher velocity and catch it, coupling at a distance, so that the thing will form, in each case, vector field at a distance, that is, energy at a distance. In the pulse mode, the energy will form suddenly with a big bang, and we'll get something like an electrical explosion of enormous density at a distance. In the second, a fireball, if you will. In the second instance, the continuous mode, we will form, for example, a ball of energy, but the energy will be sustained because it is continually being fed from the Moray generators or from the advanced power source. So we have 2 main modes, pulse and continuous. There are several modes in addition that each one of these can be used in. And let's look at our next slide to look at some of these effects. And on this slide, for example, we show a schematic of that artist's concept shown in Aviation Week. For example, we might speak of the size of the ball of energy that we create at a distance. If we make a relatively small ball, just a few kilometers or even 10 or 20 kilometers across, we can have a rather substantial amount of energy density in that ball. In fact, enormous if we're feeding it from the Moray amplifiers. So the small ball can be used to vaporize a physical object such as a re-entry vehicle, an airplane, or a missile. On the other hand, if we expand the ball to very large dimensions, let us say 20 or 50 kilometers across, for example, the energy density will be much less. However, the density is still being produced very sharply, the vector energy. That constitutes an electromagnetic pulse very similar to something that comes out of a nuclear explosion. And so in this fashion, it can be extended to a very large ball and still accomplish EMP degradation or damage or destruction of the electromagnetic circuits inside airplanes and missiles and reentry vehicles, for example, and also the electronic circuits inside nuclear warheads. So the ball can be used or expanded to be used for a very great coverage, or it can be used for a very small coverage but extremely high vaporization coverage of a vehicle. It can be used several thousand kilometers, for example, away from the basic Tesla howitzer that is projecting it. Now on this slide, for example, coming from that large globe use, we see a case taken from Afghanistan, seen by Nick Downey. This, for example, article is reproduced from the London Times. This incident and a series of these incidents were seen by Downey, and they occurred in September 1979. If you recall, in September 1979, September the 22nd to be exact, we had the first so-called nuclear flash seen off the coast of southwest Africa and picked up by our Vela satellites. And so we have a very close synchronization in time between the incidents seen in the Soviet Union from Afghanistan by Nick Downey in September 79 and the so-called nuclear flash off the coast of southwest Africa seen by the Vela satellites. This ball, as you can see here, has been expanded to enormous size and is usable in the EMP mode. In other words, it could be, for example, an anti-ballistic missile defense, an anti-cruise missile defense, or an anti-bomber defense. It is useful against all three forms by furnishing a very high EMP into any vehicle that penetrates the shield itself, or the ball. Now on this slide we show how the flash, so-called nuclear flash, off the coast of Africa was produced, the one seen by the Vela satellite in 1979. What we have is a howitzer, a Tesla howitzer, very similar to that one at Sereshigin, possibly that exact howitzer. We produce from the two antennas first a ball form which is traveling at a certain velocity. This velocity may be slower than the speed of light or faster than the speed of light. We calculate the time delay to wait until we fire another ball exactly like that, but at a greater intensity and therefore a greater velocity. So we fire then a second ball or form, three-dimensional form, behind it. The second one then is overtaking the first ball. And we have calculated the time delay so that the second form overtakes the first one over the target area, couples with it, instantly forming electromagnetic energy, exactly like the EMP, the sudden formation of EMP from a nuclear explosion. You get exactly the two pulse symptoms that you get from a nuke explosion in this kind of an affair. And that's exactly what the Vela satellite saw. We point out to you that the second so-called flash, seen in 1980 in the same general area by the Vela satellites, appeared in the infrared only. They had no visible spectrum. And the entire analysis community is presently divided over exactly what they were. They indeed were not nuclear. There was no radioactivity associated with either one at all. They were not normal phenomena because one wouldn't go in the visible spectrum and the other infrared only. They were indeed from a Tesla interferometer and very probably from the one at Sereshigin, or one very similar to that one. And that is the way they are produced. Their energy is produced at a distance by that howitzer. There is, in fact, a whole series of incidents of this nature and other kinds of nature that are traceable to the Tesla interferometry effects and Tesla technology. For example, this slide that we're showing now shows a peculiar incident that is happening with the British satellite, the Ariel 6. When the satellite is over British Columbia or over one of the oceans, the Caspian Sea, it is often turned off on two of its coded command channels, only if the sun is shining. Now, this is even though the channel is coded. You can, for example, condition the satellite before it enters the mysterious turn-off zone by preconditioning it, turning it on in advance, and then it'll sail through without being turned on. The reason is it's very simple with a very small device, Tesla interferometer, to produce energy onto that satellite itself. and to produce it internally to the circuitry. It doesn't matter about the coding on the command circuitry. And so they can turn it on or turn it off if they wish. In fact, you can couple onto the two scalars that already form a vector wave. You can couple in a fashion to increase that vector wave if you couple in phase with it, or you can couple in a fashion to decrease the wave if you couple 180 out from it. And so you can use the same Tesla scalar interferometry effect to form onto a vector wave at a distance, additional vector wave to reinforce it, or other vector waves to kill it. In other words, you can extinguish or augment electromagnetic circuits at a distance with the same effect. And this is one of those that's being tested or has been repeatedly tested on a British satellite. As you know, a few years back, a series of U.S. satellites were also mysteriously blinded from the Soviet Union, in some cases up to 4 hours duration. Now, it's been suggested that those were done with lasers. If they indeed were done by lasers from the ground, then the Soviets have achieved a state of laser technology completely unknown to the West. It would be very simple to do that blinding of the satellites, messing up their circuitry, so to speak, without damage, without permanent damage, by using very simple Tesla scalar interferometry at a distance. And as we've pointed out, the phi field is probably being used. We also point out that you can use the A field, the so-called vector magnetic potential field, in a different manner from what is presently known in ordinary electromagnetics. If you will check, for example, Feynman's 3 volumes of physics, if you will check in the 2nd volume, you will find that an experiment was done to see whether or not the A field was a mathematical figment or whether or not it was a real fundamental field of nature. The experiment proved conclusively that the A field, even when separated from the del cross operator that yields B field or magnetic field, is indeed a fundamental new field of nature. In other words, the present A field that's in the theory is used totally, always coupled with a magnetic field. We have not explored the use of the uncoupled A field whatsoever. But every magnetic circuit, for example, that has a coil in it, with the current going around through the coil, has a swirling A field in it. And we can, if we wish, disconnect that A field from the magnetic field, in which case we have a new kind of field presently unknown and unutilized in Western technology. So the combination of the phi field technology and the A field technology will yield the full extent of the Tesla technology. As we said, many other cases of apparent Soviet testing of the Tesla technology has been going on around the world. Even in Vietnam, for example, we had some mysterious occurrences with our F-111 shown on this slide. Now, the F-111 is a very nice aircraft. It has a terrain-following radar. It has the latest and most sophisticated systems that the West can build. And so when we deployed that new system into the Vietnam War in great haste, it's quite reasonable to suppose that the Soviet Union would like to have it and like to have access to a knowledge of its weapon systems, its radar, and so forth. And so we find, if we look at the next slide, that a very strange thing happened in Vietnam connected with the F-111. In fact, when the F-111 was deployed, very rapidly 8 of them fell out of the sky mysteriously. No Mayday messages, no nothing. Thereafter, in some 4,000 missions or so, no more F-111s fell out of the sky. Now, the F-111 flies so low and so fast when it's going in on its mission that it outruns its own sound. And so the troops and the ground guns normally get very little warning. They can, of course, track it on radar, but it's going so fast that it's very difficult for ground fire to hit it, or the missiles that were deployed inside North Vietnam. However, another strange thing happened. For example, during the prisoner of war exchange, we recovered 1 crew, and they told a story of going in towards Hanoi, hot and fast, and suddenly having all the lights lighted to show that all the systems were failing simultaneously. They got out of the plane, ejected safely, but the plane, so far as they knew, was not hit by ground fire, by a missile, or by a rocket. In other words, we have here a plane which was not hit by anything, but which showed by its indicator lights that all its systems were failing simultaneously. Everything electrical on that airplane was failing. And so I submit to you that that's probably an indication of the use of a Tesla weapon. For example, if the Tesla weapon was being used to extinguish the electromagnetic currents flowing in the electromagnetic circuits, in other words, in an extinguishing mode. As all the voltages started falling, that's exactly the symptoms you would have had. And so that what they did was disable the electromagnetics in the airplane, forcing it to crash, and then they recovered the parts. When they had enough of the parts to have everything they needed, they quit knocking down F-111s. They also probably took the magic boxes with them that they'd coupled into the radars to do that, and took them back to Russia. They weren't about to give those devices to the North Vietnamese. So it's my thesis that there's a high probability that the mysterious loss of those F-111s was largely due to the use of Soviet Tesla weapons in North Vietnam. Now, in September 1976, here is an example shown on this slide of the use of a Tesla weapon in the continuous small fireball mode. This one was seen by a British airline flight over Lithuania, and it was seen for several minutes. A glowing fireball formed below the airplane. In fact, the pilot contacted the Soviet authorities in alarm, and the Soviet authorities in effect told him to mind his own business and go ahead and get the heck out of there. What we have is a deliberate use of this weapon, or exposure of the airliner and the pilot and the crew to this weapon. The Soviets knew that the airline pilot and crew would see the ball and would be alarmed. They knew that when they returned, they would report this incident to the British authorities. And what they're doing is they're using this as a stimulus to Britain to see if the British know anything at all about the Tesla technology. By their response, then, from a series of incidents such as this, they can determine whether or not the West, in fact, knows of this technology. In many, many such incidents which have occurred, the stimulus has evoked the response always that showed the West knows nothing of the Tesla technology. And so the Soviets know for certain that we know nothing of the scalar wave or scalar interferometry. And here, of course, on the second slide is a close-up of the same phenomenon. You can see here the ball underneath the airline, closer up. Here is a second incident taken from Iran, from an airplane beginning to land or coming in to land at the airport, seen deep within the Soviet Union. And this is the same Tesla interferometer shown in the very large globe or very large form use. In other words, the EMP use is being tested. What the airliner saw was indeed a glow on the horizon which formed itself into a ball and then which rapidly grew. The intensity of the glow diminished as the size of this thing grew until it was enormous, seeming to fill that whole part of the heavens. Another airplane also saw the same phenomenon. This is in 1976 as shown on the slide. The next slide is a close-up of the same phenomenon. And as you can clearly see from the close-up, the size of the globe is truly enormous. We're talking about a phenomenon which is many, many kilometers across in diameter. And so we're talking about something which can be used in the EMP mode to cover a whole region of the sky against incoming attackers, whether or not they are ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, bombers, whatever. In fact, the primary development of the Tesla weapons seems to have been done with a view towards ballistic missile defense. The Soviets for some time, at least since the late 60s, have stated that they had 100% defense against ballistic missiles, strategic ballistic missiles, ICBMs. They have stated, for example, that the Western alliance has no such defenses and does not know this technology. Based on the scalar Tesla technology, that statement could indeed be accurate. And we show on this slide that we're seeing now the uses of the Tesla technology in a ballistic missile defense mode, primarily in the missile defense against ICBMs. Now, turning to the slide, for example, we see first of all the use of the large globe method, or the large globe mode. We produce out in space, many thousands of kilometers away from the projector, a very large globe of energy. The energy is actually in just a thin hemispherical shell where the two forms coupled, and so it's very dense. Even though it's very large, it's still dense by normal standards. And any vehicle or object entering that particular shell experiences a very sharp and very large EMP, much like from a nuclear explosion. That'll disable the electronics that's in any vehicle coming in. It covers a very large region of space, for example, and so is used against a large number of vehicles coming in to dud them, to dud their electromagnetics. In the second mode that we show the smaller ball, which is now being placed on the nose of an incoming vehicle. And in this mode, what we've done is we actually vaporize the physical vehicle itself. It simply goes just like a bug hitting one of these electrical bug screens. And we see various other fireballs. They can be continuous if they're fed from a continuous power source to the projector, or they can be a pulse mode if they're fed, for example, from the explosive generators. The howitzer is always usable in a pulse mode. And we see a series of these being used to clean up individual objects that are coming in towards the defense. Finally, down on the end, we see something that is very magical. We see a very large hemispherical dome, which is the final shield against anything which may enter this area. This dome may be, for example, 50 or even 100 kilometers across the base. It is the Tesla shield that Tesla spoke of in the 20s and 30s when he said he had produced a shield or a weapon which would end all war because you could make a defense impenetrable. And then on our next slide, we'll take a look at the Tesla shield. To obtain a Tesla shield, what is done with the Tesla projector or the Tesla howitzer is to produce first a very slow hemispherical three-dimensional form. In other words, the wave form is a hemisphere, and it moves out very slowly. And so what we have is a growing hemisphere which moves up very slowly in altitude. Then behind that, we produce a second such hemisphere which moves at a little faster velocity and moves up from inside the other one until just as it meets it. In fact, to be specific, when it meets the special relativity condition, when the distance, delta L, between the two, divided by the time delay between them, delta t, is equal to the speed of light, that defines a vector wave. That point defines the pair coupling for the two scalar waves into an ordinary electromagnetic wave energy. And so what we have now is an ordinary thin shell, hemispherical shell, of very dense energy indeed. And so the air in that region is instantly ionized, and it's a total plasma. And so it's glowing from the decay of the excited states and giving off photons. So what we see is a huge luminous hemispherical dome, highly bright, highly glowing, giving off photons. And any vehicle which hits that particular hemispherical shell gets such an enormous energy discharge upon it that it simply vaporizes, as we said before, like a little bug hitting one of these electrical bug screens. It goes, and that's all for that vehicle. It does not matter what kind of vehicle. And so when we add all the Tesla systems together in all four modes, we find that the Soviet statement that they have 100% ABM defense and the West does not is in fact not idle conjecture at all. In fact, we can even defend with such a process against the gamma radiation and the heat radiation and the EMP from a nuclear explosion. For example, as shown on this slide, if we nest the Tesla shields, and I've chosen to show 3, we might use 2, we might use 4, certainly 4 would be enough, but 3 is probably enough. If we nest the shields like this inside by multiple howitzers or multiple forms produced by the same howitzer, we then find a very strange thing. First of all, we forget about the normal stuff coming in, decoys, warheads, debris, and so forth. All of that stuff is going to get cleaned up by the first shield. The thing we really worry about is if we had a high-altitude nuclear explosion over the shield area, very high and over all the shields. In that case, the explosion would produce EMP, heat, and gamma radiation. In the first shield, we will have an awful lot of scattering and absorption reactions occurring for all 3 processes. We know that when gammas, for example, are absorbed, they are normally re-radiated at lower temperature, for example, at X-rays. And then we have another absorption and re-radiation, and that lowers the temperature. Finally, by the time we get through all 3 shields, we've cleaned up just about everything that's in there, including the EMP, which went through the same sort of thing. And so by nesting the shields, we can defend against the effects of a high-altitude nuclear burst suppression, the gammas, the heat, and the EMP. Again, the Soviet statement that their particular technology yields 100% ABM defense is not idle conjecture. We point out again, and pause here with the next slide, Brezhnev's strange 1975 statement, introduced to the SALT talks, that we should also consider outlawing the development of new kinds of weapons more frightful than the mind and imagination of man had ever even dreamed of. And on this slide we show the beginning of such weapons, as which Brezhnev was referring to. We show, for example, that the Tesla technology essentially gives us almost Star Wars now, which has been taken as the title of this slide. For example, if I have Moray technology, I can package enormous energy sources and power supplies in a very small weight and a very small volume. And so they become usable in space in re-entry systems. If I use the Tesla interferometer technology, all that I need is a MIRV vehicle. I need one which I can drop off additional vehicles from and establish an interferometer in space. And I've shown here a couple of re-entry systems coming in that have multiple re-entry vehicles with them. And they are being powered by Moray technology, and they are using scalar interferometry technology a la Tesla. In such case, these things become emitters of enormous power, enormous weapons, almost like ray weapons, except the energy will be produced at a distance instead of traveling through space. Energy is vectors. It is not scalars. What happens is we fire first a scalar wave at a target, let us say a missile site. We fire then a second scalar wave right behind it, and we get the fireball burst occurring right on the missile site itself. We get EMP, we get all the things from a nuclear explosion, except it's all electrical. We don't get the radioactive fallout, and we do not destroy the farmlands. The Soviets do not care about New York City or any other large U.S. city. They really care about the U.S. farmland, which is what they really need from us. And so anything which serves as an emitter can now become an enormously powerful emitter, and it can become a sort of blaster or fireball blaster at a distance. And I've shown that Star Wars and battle stations in space, which we are only now beginning to think about in the West from the standpoint of lasers and particle beams, have already become possible in the Soviet Union by using the Tesla technology. Also, I show that a satellite, for example, can be set up in the same mode, and any emitter now becomes a primary weapon system. If you think about the enormous numbers of Soviet emitters which exist throughout their system, both on the ground and in the air, you then become concerned, or should become concerned, about the coupling of Tesla technology with such a large number of emitters, wherein the emitters themselves become primary weapons and primary blasters. For example, if we have a small jammer coming in against a field army force to jam some of the radars, we might have a small one that produces 2 kilowatts of power. But with the Tesla technology, he can put that 2 kilowatts of power right around the antenna of his target radar. I assure you that any Western radar we have today with 2 kilowatts of power in a little globe around it will simply blow out all the transistors and all the circuits. And that radar will be blown right off the air immediately. And so will our communication centers and everything else we're using that has particularly digital state electronics, which are very sensitive to EMP, particularly EMP produced directly in and on the circuits themselves. So what we have is a case where all of those enormous number of emitters can become blasters. And so we can reason that the Soviets will make a substantial number of them the primary weapons on the battlefield, a weapon which we presently have no means of countering whatsoever. But of course, in pausing, we have spoken of many weapons, and fantastic weapons at that, that matched Brezhnev's strange 1975 statement. The use of the technology, if man can only evolve his own consciousness, is not just for war. It promises things for the future that staggers the mind of man. For example, the long-sought unified field theory is already here if we use the phi-4 field, because in being able to affect the flow of time, we can affect everything that exists in time, the gravitational field, the fundamental constants of nature, and everything. We can literally engineer the reality we exist in. I want to point out that a new super-relativity emerges also from this theory. The present relativity is based on the vector speed of light, c, and small changes in that in terms of distorted spacetimes. In this particular thing we're talking about, we control the distortion of spacetime. And so we can control the velocity of the sensor wave we use, anywhere between 0 and infinity. And so not only do we cover the band, so to speak, the velocity band from 0 to c, which is what we presently deal with in the reality we are used to, but we deal with the kind of reality that emerges when we cover the band from c to infinity. In other words, we can see and travel in and out of time. We can see and travel in and through other dimensions. We can be anywhere in the universe in an instant. We can go in here and out there with no travel in between. We can communicate at superluminal or subluminal velocities. And in fact, we'll see that the things that follow are also even more enormous than that. But my point is that the present relativity and the present electromagnetics are only highly special cases of the true relativity and the true electromagnetics that emerges from Tesla's fundamental waves and fundamental interferometry work. In fact, if we fully apply the technology, we must be prepared to deal with orders of reality. In fact, words that we presently have in our language fails us in trying to describe what emerges. We must be willing to deal with a case where we individually can be in many places at once. In fact, we could be everywhere at once if we were using a wave that had infinite velocity to do our sensing. We must be prepared for the fact that our sensor, which we normally associate to be our physical body in one little region of space-time, can be in fact placed anywhere we wish, and so we can be literally anywhere we wish with Tesla technology. We must call that orders of reality, because the present physical reality we see is only a first-order effect. It is the kind of physical reality that emerges when time, the present vector-carried time, is removed from space-time, leaving behind only space. We know from quantum mechanics that time is not an observable. That is, time has already been removed any time we observe. And all observation and all detection is purely spatial. And so the present order, the present physical reality, is only one type of reality that actually is there, that actually confronts us, and in which we actually live. With the Tesla technology, we must confront all the orders of reality, and to do that we are going to have to advance the entire consciousness of mankind. For his present consciousness is totally fitted to the photon interaction and to the vector field effect, that is, the vector movement at a limited c velocity. In dealing with that kind of reality, we must pause and point out that since the beginning of time as we know it today, man has always beset his fellow man. Being a smart animal, having a brain, and having a mind that is very clever and adaptive, he has built tools which he can use with his tool-using member, his hands. He has built ever more powerful tools in his cleverness, and he has utilized these tools ever more frightfully against his fellow human being. And so the history of mankind has been a history of struggle and domination of man against man and human against human. As the power of the tools evolved, however, man has reached the point where he has the power to destroy his biosphere. He has the power now to disrupt all the space-time smoothness in which he exists. He can reach the very fabric of the universe itself, of physical reality itself, and he can shake it, he can bend it, he can warp it, and he can twist it. In doing so, he can turn the reality in which he himself exists into a nightmare beyond his present comprehension. And so the power of tools that has been unleashed already by the Tesla technology in the hands of the Soviet Union are indeed so frightful that they boggle the mind of man, and they are more frightful than the present limited consciousness of man has ever imagined, just exactly as Brezhnev stated in 1975. We must become aware of this type of reality and this type of technology. We must evolve our consciousness, and we must leave forever the side or the set of man where man turns against his fellow man. In so doing, there is a single problem which can be overcome by the Tesla technology. This single fundamental problem is in fact responsible or involved in all human causes where one human is pitted against another. And Tesla technology can be used to overcome that. In the present first-order physical reality which we sense and live in, and which all our instruments sense as well, most of them, everything except a few obscure Geiger tubes, and once in a while something like an electron interferometer. In the first-order physical reality that we sense and live in, we consider ourselves to be apart from each other. I consider, for example, that you are distant from me. The only way that I can establish our separation is by the vector field and its limited c velocity. I have something which takes some time to travel between you and I, and that time multiplied by its velocity gives me a distance in which we are separated. And so, using the first-order reality and vector sensing, I am convinced that you are distant from me and not part of me at all. I am convinced, therefore, that if you suffer and you hurt, it does not necessarily affect me. I need not suffer and I need not hurt. In fact, if I can use a sensor wave which has infinite velocity, that is, which is everywhere at once, we confront something that is very near the Creator in its awareness, because it can be aware of everywhere at once. In that fact, or in that situation, there is no distance between you and I, or between any other two people. If we, in fact, inject such technology between us, there is no longer any between us. We can indeed become one. Just as in the individual human body, there are literally billions and billions of human cells which are so linked together, and in fact Dr. Pop has discovered that that link is a virtual field and therefore involves scalar field, for example. If we link human beings together by scalar processes which have infinite velocity and therefore no time separation and no distance separation, we indeed all become one. And the thing that is written in the Bible, that man is made in the image of his Creator, is quite indeed literally true. Each of us is the other, and we all are one. And that is where the Tesla technology must be used to carry us. It must be used to evolve humankind from its present limited consciousness to a more infinite consciousness, the consciousness of the next stage of human evolution. And so, if we can become aware of the Tesla technology, if we can first counter the Soviet weapons, and then if we can reach an agreement to banish the scourge of war and our divisions from one another forever, we can apply the technology of Tesla to mankind's betterment, to cure him, not to kill him, to make him a god, not to make him an animal. In that case, all of the things that I've shown on this slide can gradually become true, because that is man's destiny. First, we can control our lifespan. We can control all diseases. We can have superluminal communication. We can have transmutation of matter. We can produce anything and any energy that we need to produce. And eventually, we can recover our true consciousness and our true nature, which is the godhood and the God nature of mankind itself. It seems ironical to me in making such a presentation that with my Judeo-Christian background and looking at the Christian Bible, King James Version if you wish, long ago we find people writing words which, if I do away with the dogma and if I do away with the limited concepts of the time and try to express what they are saying in a non-dogmatic way and in the present concepts that we have today, they have a startling new truth. Man literally is built within the image of his Creator, or is one with the Creator himself, or he can be, because we now see and sense only the first-order reality, only a limited electromagnetic interaction, and only a limited relativity. If we build the technology to link us together and to go for the more a full and more advanced reality, we literally can recover our God nature. If so, then ironically, the strange, lonely genius, Nikola Tesla, who so many years ago, single-handedly almost, and against great odds at that, gave us the electrical 20th century, may very well have given mankind a more shining future than all the scientists and sages have envisioned. Thank you, and good evening.